Hi, this is Robin, and in this video I'm going to talk about and demonstrate how to relight photos using the lens flare and lighting effects filters in Photoshop. There's a lot of different things and components to this, so I've decided the best thing to do is to split this into a two-part set that will become part of my special effects series on my channel. So before we get into the demos and the actual use of the filters, I just wanted to set some background for this, both in terms of the goal of why you'd want to use it and some very important considerations about these filters that you should not skip over and just go straight to the demos because it's important about their longevity. Okay, so first of all, I'd say the reason that I'm focusing on this and doing this video is that an overarching goal of photography is to tell compelling visual stories and to try to hold your viewers' attention. If we use light creatively, it is one way to grab and maintain viewers' attention. So light and the choices we make about how to work with it, either in camera during our capture phase, during post-processing in Photoshop, or both times, is essential to making successful images. If we don't capture the lighting that we're satisfied with, either in the field or in studio, wherever we're shooting, I think it's nice to know that we can either correct or enhance it in Photoshop to create drama, to impact mood, or even just to be purely creative if we want to. And that doesn't matter whether you're working with composites or straight photos. These filters can be used in either kind of context. You could push it to more or less extremes depending on what you want to achieve. Now, as I said, because the scope and the number of different angles to these different filters, I've decided to split them into a two-part video set. And I'll demonstrate and share tips on how to work with both the lens flare filter in this first video and the lighting effects filter in the second video. Now here's the part I said is important, and even if you only just listen this one time and then hop around to the demos if you need to come back to them in the future. These filters are part of Photoshop's 3D capabilities. And that's important to know because Adobe has been talking fairly recently in the past year or so about phasing out their Photoshop's 3D features, and they want to try to migrate their users to their Substance suite, which is 3D oriented, and it's a completely different suite and subscription from CC, so it's an extra cost to use it. So I have some suggestions for you with regard to the lighting effects filters and lens flare filter if you think you might want to use them on an ongoing basis. And these are things for you to consider handling either before or when that phase out of the 3D capabilities happens in Photoshop. Personally, I'd suggest if you think you want to use them, do it before it happens because you just don't know how these things go. So my first suggestion is have a contingency plan. According to Adobe, Photoshop 2021 release 22.2, and I think it was in February of that year, is the most stable version of Photoshop's 3D features. So I would suggest that if you want to work with any of the 3D features, so including the lighting filters, but any of the other 3D features in Photoshop, that you download and keep a copy of that release as quote-unquote insurance. Okay, and again, that was Photoshop 2021 release 22.2. Okay, just know you can have more than one release of Photoshop on your computer. You can only use one at a time, but you can certainly have the current release and an earlier release or releases on your computer. It really has to do more with the memory on your computer than the ability to be able to download more than one year, annual, or interim release. Okay. Having that Photoshop 2021 release will ensure that you'd still have access to the lighting effects filters and the lens flare filters if they are phased out of future Photoshop releases. So that's why I'm mentioning that right up front. The second thing to keep in mind is that Adobe offers some free lighting overlay assets. I don't know if they're trying to compensate from the fact that they're going to take away some of these other more interactive types of lighting filters. But I will put a link in the to the freebies in the description below this video so that you can locate those overlays and download them if you're interested in getting them. Those assets would get stored in your Adobe library, and you can just use them from inside Photoshop if you want to. So again, they're not going to work in the same way as the 3D and adapt and conform to subjects in your images, but you can overlay them onto your images, adjust the size of them, move them, rotate them, change the colors, things like that. So it's better than nothing if you don't want to be dealing with these other filters I'm going to demonstrate. And then the third thing to keep in mind is that there are third parties out there in the world who offer free lighting brushes that will let you paint in lighting effects. So they're pretty similar in a way to the overlays, except that you can just do some more specific sizing and placement with the brushes and just paint them in. So I'm not affiliated in any way with these third parties who offer the free lighting brushes. I'm not endorsing any of them in particular, but I will list a source whose brushes I have tried also in the description below the video. So I would say if you want, do a web search for other options and just do a search on free lighting brushes for Photoshop and see what you come up with if you're interested in that. Now, I just want to let you know this workshop video that I'm doing right now will not cover the use of the Adobe overlays or the third-party lighting brushes. I also will not cover using bump maps for texture mapping with the lighting effects filter in these videos, but I will show you the full span of lens flares in this video, and I'll show you a mix of some of the different lighting effects in the second video. Okay. One more housekeeping thing or two here. So before we start the demos, I just want to remind you, if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, and it just means follow me for free, you can click the subscribe button and the black bell icon below the video, and then you'll get a single alert directly from YouTube when I post new content. If you've already subscribed, you're all set. You'd only need to do it once. Also, I will include the start times to each of the topics and demos in this two-part workshop series, and the description below the videos will have that information so you can hop around to different videos or return to just the ones you want in the future. Okay. I do want to let you know I will include several different techniques, demos for each of the lighting filters, the lens flare, and the lighting effects. So I just, again, think it's best if I split this into a two-part video. Also, just so you know, it's not going to just be the same thing over and over again for each demo, because I will show different approaches or techniques that you can use, and then you can decide for your image which is the one you would like to use. Okay, so now let's get into this part one with all the background out of the way. This is where I'm sort of starting the content for part one video on the lens flare filter and how to use it. Now, for context, lens flares happen when a bright light hits your camera's lens. So you've probably seen this in photos of yours. It shows up as glowing circles or rings, which is typically referred to as ghosting. Or you can see starbursts, in which, and actually you can purposely or purposefully create starbursts when you're shooting if you set your aperture to a smaller size, like an f11 to an f16. And then another type of flare, lens flare, is kind of a general haze, and that's called veiling. So those are the three main types of flares. And then in cinematography, if you're at all interested in that or want to produce a look of a cinematography, kind of a look in your images, you should be aware that they use these anamorphic lenses. and they have a wider field of view, and what their lens flares do is tend to create these horizontal flares. So I think that's important to mention those different types of lens flares, because all those different lens flare styles I just mentioned can be emulated using Photoshop's lens flare filter. And the lens flare filter, again, do's and don'ts kinds of stuff, works with either 8-bit or 16-bit images, so that's good, gives you some flexibility there. It will not work on an empty layer, so you have to have a content layer to go into the lens flare filter. Very important, the lens flare filter is inherently destructive. And in Photoshop, what destructive means is it changes your original image's pixels. So, and then you just can't go back. It's sort of baked in a new image, okay? So I suggest that you work non-destructively so that you can go back, make tweaks or changes to the lens flares that you create, and I will show 3 different techniques for working with lens flare and also different techniques for working non-destructively in the 3 demos that I'm going to show you relating to lens flare in this first video. Okay, all that's out of the way. So now we're going to start with the demo with this first image. We have this young boogie boarder on a beach, and he's out on a sunny day. And as I said, what I'd like to do is, first of all, work with this image non-destructively. So the first thing to do that I always do with images is to duplicate in your layers panel, mine is over here in the upper right, your background layer. And you can left click and drag that down to the add new layer icon, which is the box with the plus, or on that background layer, you can do Control or Command J to jump that duplicate copy up onto that second layer. Okay, so now that we have a duplicate copy, as I said, we want to work non-destructively. So another way to do that is to convert this duplicate layer into a smart object. That will let you go back and make tweaks and changes if you want to. So over in this empty right-hand area, right-click, get this pull-down menu and get Convert to Smart Object. So left-click on that, and you can see that now there's this new little icon in the lower right corner of your thumbnail, and that shows you that that's now a smart object. So now that we have a duplicate layer with a smart object, we're going to go to the top of the interface, to the filter menu, left-click on that, come down to where it says Render. Come out to the flyout box here, and we're going to click on lens flare. So filter, render, lens flare. Okay, and you get this pop-up box. Okay, and what we have in this box is, you can see that it's your image, or my image in this case. There's a little plus sign that represents where the flare is, and this is repositionable. So you would just left click on that little plus symbol and be able to move your flare around wherever you want to place it, okay? And we have a brightness slider, so we can left or right. Left is less bright. You watch the flare up here and you can see what's happening. Right is more flare, okay? So I'm gonna keep it down just so I can see what's what. And it's pretty tiny, but you can see then, as I said, this box emulates those 4 different types of flares that I told you about. So first we have this 50 to 300 millimeter zoom flare. We have a 35 millimeter prime flare, and you can see that's a little bit more starbursty. So this one was more the circular ring type I told you about. This is more of the starburst. And then the 105 prime is more of the hazy type of flare that I told you about in the intro. And I remember I mentioned the anamorphic lenses, so you can see with the movie prime you get more of these horizontal flares. So I'm not going to be working with that cinematography look, but for what I want, of the ones I just looked at, I think this 50 to 300 millimeter zoom is going to give me the best look I want. And what I am going for in this image, first of all, is I kind of want it to be a soft, warm, kind of dreamy editorial look. So like if he was in a magazine or a catalog and they wanted him to look like he was out on a hot sunny day and the sun is kind of really warm here. So I want to use this flare to emulate the sun. So first of all, looking at the image, you can see the light direction is coming from the right and down. So I want to move my light source, my flare, over so where it could be casting some more light on him, okay? And you can see I've dragged it to the edge of the image, so it doesn't have to be in. It can be right on the edge and just casting some of the flare in. You position it wherever you want for your application. Okay, next that I've got that position by clicking on that plus and moving it around, I'm coming to the brightness slider, and I'm going to just start sliding this and watching the flare and seeing how it looks as I go. And normally with these sliders and these pop-up boxes, I just do a little bit and then release just to see if it's giving me a look I want. Maybe I'm much, I'll have to see. Okay, so that's pretty good. I think that's okay there, and I feel pretty good about the position. Maybe just move it down a little bit, and I'm going to center that plus sign on the boundary at the frame in this image. So once you get yours, or you want, get the positioning, get the kind of flare, and get the brightness where you want, then click OK to accept it. And if we come back to the layers panel here on the right, you'll see that now we have generated 3 layers. So this one that was the background copy, and that became the launch layer, I'm going to call this the lens flare output. Oops, helps if you can spell. Output layer. Okay, so it has generated that output layer on this smart object here. And again, because we went in as a smart object, we get these other sublayers. So you get a white mask. So let's say you don't want the flare to show on a certain part of your image. You clicking on this mask to make it active, so you can see that there's a white frame around it. You could use your brush tool. Where's our paintbrush tool? Right there. It looks like a brush in your toolbar. And then with black as your color, you could paint away the areas that you don't want your flare to show. I want mine to show as it is, so I'm not going to paint anything away. Then here's the other big benefit that I mentioned. We get this sublayer that says lens flare. So I told you you can make tweaks and changes. If you double click on the word lens flare, it relaunches this lens flare pop-up box with the settings that you just used. So if you say, you know what, I was a little conservative with that flare, I'm not really seeing as much as I'd like to on this layer, let me just crank it up a little bit higher and see if I can get more of an effect from that. And then you just click on the handle and start dragging. And again, I'm watching here to see what happens. I don't want to go too nuts. One thing to keep in mind, and again, it depends on what you're trying to be, how creative you're trying to be, or how realistic is. And I'm going to click OK once I make that adjustment and add more flare. Yeah, so you can see that's added a lot more flare than was there before or from the original. So if you say, oh, you know, I don't want to go back in again, let me just, in my layers panel, come to the opacity slider up at the top, and you can left click on that word and drag, or you can click on this little down arrow and pull the slider. Either way, I like to just left click on the word. And so if it's too much, you can ease it in with the opacity slider there. Yeah, so I think that's enough. So what I was going to say is sometimes if you do too much flare, you start to obscure your details. So I wanted just enough, and let me turn this off and on, to add that interest, to give it that warm, sunny, sun-kissed look and add some more interest, and as I said, more of an editorial kind of a look. So again, you can choose the kind of flare you want to use and decide the amount you want to use. But that was what I wanted to show you for the first demo of working with the lens flare filter in Photoshop, working with a smart object on your duplicate layer and sending that into the lens flare filter. So I'm going to close this out and not save it before we move into the second demo. Okay, this is going to be demo number 2 for the lens flare filter. And let me just scoot this over a little bit. Okay, so as I said in demo number 1, we're still working with the lens flare filter in Photoshop, but with a different type of example. And same thing though, we want to have our workflow be non-destructive, but I'm going to use a different approach. So the first, always basic approach is to duplicate your background layer. So drag that to the bottom of the layers panel to the add new layer icon, which is the box with the plus, or use a Control or Command J to jump this up as a background layer, their background copy. Now, the thing that I'm going to do different this time is bottom of the layers panel, come down to that same add new layer icon, which is that box with the plus, left click on that, and we get an empty layer. Now, as I said before we started the demos, you cannot launch into the lens flare filter from an empty layer. So we need to do something with this to put some content here before we go in there. So what I'm going to do is fill this transparent empty layer with black. The way I'm going to do that is press Shift and backspace key. I'm on a Windows machine, so I hope I don't send you astray here, but I think on a Mac it would be Shift and Delete. So on Windows, again, Shift and backspace to get this fill box, and I think on a Mac it's Shift and Delete. And so I said I want to fill this with black, so you can see the contents is where you would look for that. You can either come down to the bottom to get the black, or if your foreground color in your color picker is black, then you can pick foreground color, but I'm just going to choose black. Make sure the mode is normal and the opacity is 100%. Do not have this checked on, leave preserve transparency checked off, and click OK. And you can see now this has been changed to a wholly black layer. Now, what did I say before? Important to make it a smart object so that we can make tweaks. So in this empty area to the right of the text, just right click and convert this to a smart object. And you can see that happen because it put that little smart object icon there. Now, if I turn off the eye visibility for just a moment, because we've completely blocked out our image, let's just look at the image here. So as I said, I want to add a flare, and this time I want to add it behind this building, so somewhere in this general area. And this time I want to use a starburst style. So again, you can see there was no sun to be shooting into, so we're going to simulate it and emulate it here. And so if the sun was up in this direction, you could sort of tuck it behind the building and use a small aperture. You could get that nice sunburst effect, but that didn't happen with this beautiful blue sky here. So the thing I'm trying to point out here is to, while you're on the image, notice generally where you want your flare to be, because it's going to go in as a black layer and you won't see that. So this is roughly, if you were thinking the rule of thirds on the where two different thirds lines are intersecting. Okay, so I will turn back the visibility for my launch layer, which is this black layer, and you can see it's highlighted. Again, we're going to go to the filter menu, top of the interface, come down to render, so filter, render, and again lens flare, filter, render, lens flare. Click on that and we get our lens flare pop-up box. Okay, as you saw in the last example, you see how the flare looks. We get, let me pull this down so we can adjust it to where we want. And you've got that plus sign to be able to move your flare around that you would just left click on and drag. And then we have the 4 different lens types. And I remember from the last one that this is the 35mm prime is the one that gives me more of that starburst kind of a look. So I am going to use that 35mm prime to tuck that lens flare behind, that starburst lens flare behind that building as sort of a backlit effect. And I said it was going to be in roughly this general area on the original image. I'm going to give it some more brightness than what it has right now. That's pretty good, actually. I kind of like that. I'm going to leave it there because I can see the obvious flares. I can see some haze around those flares, which is what you would get in a real life situation. If you were shooting towards the sun, you probably would get some of these artifacting sub flares with the different colored circles. So I'm going to leave that there for now, and I'm going to click OK. And again, we get 3 layers by using the Smart Object. We get the lens flare. This time it's the starburst that I used. Output, so that's the output layer. We get the mask. So if for some reason you didn't want to have these ancillary starburst flare components, artifacts, whatever you want to call them, you could click on this white mask, use your paintbrush from the toolbar, and painting with black, paint with black on the area of the image where you don't want those, and you can hide them, but they are built into the flare, so you're going to get them. You would just have to eliminate them if you don't want them. Again, you can double click on the words lens flare to take you back in, and if you say, you know, I am not sure I wanted this to be this size, then you could increase the brightness or whatever, but I feel pretty good about it for mine, so I'm just going to click cancel. But I wanted to again remind you, if you're hopping around in your demos, that you can go back in, make tweaks. You could even change the flare type if you decide a different one would look better. And so I'm going to hit cancel. Now, needless to say, we can't see the image anymore. So on this lens flare output layer with it highlighted in blue like that, we want to use a blend mode. And these are the where it says normal, that's the default blend mode. Click on that little down arrow, and you want to click on screen to hide the black and have the white come forward. So screen blend mode, and that reveals your flare. Okay, so one of the reasons that I like to use this approach with that empty layer is that now we can use in the toolbar, mine is docked right, yours might be on the left, this cross tool up at the top, which is the move tool. If you left click on that, make sure it's active with the black behind it. Now we can start moving this flare around if you're looking at my image. So you wouldn't have been able to do this on the previous demo that I told you because it would be in the image. You'd be moving the whole image. So by having the lens flare on its own layer, you can move this around. So let's say you want this to be more kind of tucked partially behind that building. So that's where I position it now. I have my starburst, and there's the hot spot of the flare that's showing there, so that's great. And I've repositioned my flare on that image. And I like this because, you know, that's that dinky little image in that pop-up box for the lens flare filter. This, you're working on a bigger image and you can be more precise about where you are positioning it. Okay, so now I've got it where I want it positioned. I personally like to get off of the move tool, and I always treat the lasso as my neutral tool. You don't have to do that. Okay, so let's say then you maybe want to crank up or increase the saturation or the vibrance of this color that's in this lens flare. So now again, this is all optional, but I just want to show you things you can do with this so that if you want to do it with yours. So bottom of the layers, so you've created your lens flare. We're kind of set with the lens flare at this point. Now we're doctoring it and making it pretty. So bottom of the layers panel, come to the circle with the line through it, which is the add adjustment layer. Left click on that. And I'm going to come down to vibrance. Here we go. So now we have a vibrance adjustment layer, and in the properties panel, so here's my properties panel for that vibrance layer. In the properties panel, you have a vibrance slider and a saturation slider. So if you want to, if you can watch over here, increase the vibrance for that, let me just put it pretty, you can go up or down like that, okay? Now, you'll notice when I did that, what happened? It impacted my entire image. I've gotten used to just looking where I want to look and doing it after the fact. So let me put the vibrance to there. But what you need to do to be sure that the vibrance or the saturation only impacts the lens flare is to clip this layer, the vibrance or whatever adjustment layer you're working with to the lens flare layer. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. In the properties panel for that layer, you can either click on this little icon here that looks like a box with an arrow coming down from it, or what I prefer to do is you press and hold the Alt or the Option key, and then you hover between the layers until you get that box with the little down arrow. And when you get that, you left click, and you can see it has now, it's put this little down arrow here. It has clipped the vibrance layer to the lens flare layer. So now if you make adjustments to the vibrance or even to the saturation, if you want to, just to make it obvious so you can see what's happening, you only are affecting the lens flare. Okay, so that was the next thing that I wanted to show you. Now, one other, again, optional type of thing that I want to show you here with something like this, because clearly the flare is just going in front of the building, and that might be fine for what you want to accomplish, and realistically it might do that. But let's just say you want it completely behind the building and you want it to make it look more backlit. And again, yours could be a person, yours could be a tree, it doesn't have to be a building. So whatever it is that you're working with. For me and my image, I would come back to my background layer, and I'm just going to, at this point, call this the building, okay, just so we know what we're talking about. Make sure that layer is active. I'm going to use the Object Selection tool, which in the toolbar is this box with an arrow going into it, so left click on that to make it active and show the black. And then I'm just going to trace around this white building, and hopefully Photoshop will select just that building for me. There it is. So now we have a selection with marching ants around that white building. What I want to do is copy that selection onto its own empty layer. Okay, so we're making a copy of just that. Going to do basically the same thing I told you to do as a way you could do the duplicate here. So Control or Command J, and you can see here we have jumped just that building. This is the building selection onto its own layer. So now what I'm going to do is, again, with that layer active, I'm going to left click on the thumbnail and drag it to the top of the layer stack and release. So now it's gone from this third position layer up to the top. And look what it's done here. I'll turn this off and on. So with it off, this is how it was with the flare that we added some vibrance to, clipped to that layer. The flare is going in front of the building. If you want to make it look more backlit, you bring the building up, part of the building up, to hide that flare that was in front, and now you've got it backlit. Now, I'm not going to keep going with this because it'll just turn into a whole different thing than being about lens flares. But the thing to keep in mind when using the lens flare, and I said it in the first demo with the boy on the beach, and I'll say it in this one, think realistically, where is the light source and what would happen realistically with light. So when we put the flare in for him on the beach, I looked to see where the light was on him to see where the source of light would be. Realistically, if you have a backlit building or a subject of some sort, it's going to be darker because the light is behind it. So just know that you'll have to either reactivate this selection of this and then lower the exposure or the brightness, or use curves or level and slightly lower the brightness of this building, because otherwise it won't look realistic with the backlighting. So just keep that in mind. So anyway, we have gone from this to this, and I think it just adds some more interest to the image, as I said, and that's a big motivation for working with these lens flares and different lighting effects. So that was the end of that demo on how to create the lens flare, and then two optional bits about, how to maybe adjust the color of it. You could use a hue saturation instead of the vibrance and alter the color of the lens flare if you want. And then how you could bring part of your image to the top of the layer stack if you want to have your lens flare behind something. Okay, so I'm going to close this out and move to the third and final demo for this part 1 lens flare video. Okay, and so now I'm going to be working with this image. This was the starting image that I'm working, that I had. It was a stock image, and let me just put that there so we can see it. And I have already done more of a conversion to a day to night kind of a look on it. And let me move this up so we have a little bit more space to work, and see if I can make this larger. Okay, so you can see I've changed what was a daytime original image into something that looks a little bit more nighttime. I used a sky replacement, a night sky replacement from the edit menu. All right. And so I put a night sky in there, and then I used a color lookup from my, over here on the right in my layers panel. I went to color lookup and I chose a lookup table or a color lookup that was a day to night color lookup, and applied that over the whole image. So that's how I got to this stage. The thing is, we've got sort of a dusky night image, but we have two street lamps that aren't lit that probably would be at this time of day. So I want to use a lens flare to put some lights into my street lights here. Okay, so we're using, again, yet another application in this third demo. We're going to light these two street lights. So again, first things first, we're going to duplicate the layer, drag it to the bottom of the layers panel to the add new layer icon. I'm going to add an empty layer, and I'm going to fill that with black with a shift backspace. And again, I hope it's shift delete on a Mac, and then use the contents, put black into that empty layer and click OK. And then convert this to a smart object by right clicking in the empty space on that layer and coming down to where it says convert to smart object and making sure we have that little icon there. Okay, so now again, this time I'm going to use, I think, probably a different lens flare just to get a different look and to let you see how it works. Okay, so again, let's just look and see where I'm going here, since we're going in with black. So we're kind of roughly in the upper left quadrant here for where I want to put that lens flare. Okay, so I can put this black layer back on. With the black layer and the smart object active, we go up to filter, down to render, and over to lens flare and left click. Okay, so now again, I'm not going to use the starburst this time. Let's just try the 105mm prime. Yeah, see, that's better for a street light. And again, I want to position this closer to where my street lamp was, which I think was up somewhere roughly in this area over here. And this is kind of bright for a street light, so I'm going to take that down. I'm watching the little box to see what's happening. And that wasn't a super huge lamp, so I don't want to go too large. I can always come back in if I want to. I'm going to leave it around 51%, and I'm going to leave that there. So I have moved the positioning around with the X. I've chosen the type of lens flare, and I've chosen the brightness I want. So I'm going to click OK to accept that. And again, we have to use the screen blend mode in the layers panel where it says normal, go over to the down arrow, come into the second group, which are the lightning ones, and click on screen. So you want the screen blend mode. And now you can see we have our lens flare that's going to become a street light over here. So again, with this on this layer, I'm going to use my move tool, which is that cross at the top of the toolbar. Make sure it's active, and you'll know that it's active too because you'll get this pink bounding box around it. And then I'm just going to click on this flare and see, look at how much easier this is to work with on a decent sized image instead of that dinky little preview image in the lens flare filter. So I think that's pretty good, and I'm not going to worry about being too perfectionist about it. When I have a jerky mouse that's jerking around here. So I got that pretty much centered. So to me, that looks pretty good that that is centered in that lamp. So I'm going to take this off of move, and I feel pretty good about where I have that. So now, one thing I want to look at, let me just undo the screen for a moment. I'm going to go back to normal. Yeah, see, this one has those artifacts too. And for a street light, I don't think I really want to have that. So I am going to come to this mask that came back with the smart object. And so I'm going to click on it, make sure there's a white frame around it, grab my brush tool. It looks like a paintbrush from the toolbar. Make sure on black. It's 100%, yes. And on this, working on that mask, I'm just going to paint away. So the green is my highlighter, the white is the brush. I'm just painting away those artifacts from the extra artifacts from the lens flare because I don't want them. And you can see here on my mask, I've painted away those artifacts, okay? So then I'm going to come back to this layer here, and I'm going to go back to the screen blend mode. So now I just have it in the lamp because I don't think it would be doing all those artifacts in a street light type of a situation. Okay. So now what I want to do, since I want to light this lamp too, is I'm just going to grab this layer in the layers panel, and it'll pull all three of these down. And I'm just going to drag it to the bottom of the layers panel to the add new layer icon, which is the box with the plus. And now we've got a second layer. So this, I'm going to double click on here just so we don't get confused and call this Street Light 1. That's the one closest to us. And this one, I'm just double clicking on the words to create the label. And this is going to be Street Light 2. Okay, so let me just turn the eye visibility off for Street Light 1 by just clicking on that eye icon. And with this layer active, we'll go back to the move tool. And let's just move this back over to here. And you can, if you want, and I'm not going to take the time to do it, if it looks, you know, like this is actually a little big for this light, but you could go to transform and transform it, or while you're still here, you can press shift and pull in on these corners and transform it and scale it down a little bit, but I'm not going to worry about doing that for this application, just because again, our focus is on doing, creating lens flares, but just know you can resize it if you want to. All right, so I'm going to get off of the move tool since I have that where I want. And the other thing I think I'd think about is, again, sort of atmospheric perspective. As things get further away, they get a little softer and lighter. So for Street Light 2, since it's further away, I think I'm just going to lower the opacity a little bit, and it'll compensate for the size with that too, so you can see that's a little less bright. So once I get that one where I want, then I can come back to Street Light number 1 layer and turn that eye visibility back on. So now you can see we have 2 different street lights, and so we've lit up those street lights. Now again, as I said, you can do something, and so this is really what all you needed to do with regard to adding a lens flare from the filter render lens flare, and you've added some lights. But again, you can go in and optionally adjust the color. So let's just do that. So I'll turn this one off first, and let's just look at Street Light number 1. So we have the Street Light number 1 layer active with that color on there, the blue. Bottom of the layers panel, come to the add new adjustment layer icon, the circle with the line through it, left click on that. And I'm going to want to add a hue and saturation layer right above that Street Light 1. So it's right above it, you can see, okay? We need to do what we did earlier because we only want the hue and saturation to apply to the street light and not to the whole image. So we need to clip this hue and saturation layer to the street light layer. There's 2 different ways you can do it. In the properties panel for that hue saturation layer, you can click on this little icon, which is the box with the down arrow, or you can do what I prefer, which is the alter option, and then keep it depressed, and then just hover between the two layers that you want to clip together till you see that little symbol with the box with the down arrow. Click, and then you see the down arrows there. So now this hue and saturation will only be, fingers crossed, affecting this street light, okay? So the other thing to keep in mind with this is if you just want to adjust color, you can just pull the hue and saturation slider. But we're working on white, and white doesn't colorize that well. So in your hue and saturation properties panel for that hue and saturation layer, so each layer has a properties associated with it, come down to just below these sliders to where it says colorize. Click on colorize. We can click OK. And now look, watch the light. Now that I have colorized, you're going to see the color. And you can make it any, because depending on what you're doing and what you're lighting, you might want different colors. For me, with a street light, I want it to have kind of a warmish, yellowy kind of a look. And you can always reduce the opacity a bit if it's a little bit much. But to me, I like the look of that warmer light because I think that's more realistic for a street light than a white. Okay, and again, I'm not going to repeat it, but you could turn this light on and do the same kind of process in terms of clicking on that street light, bottom of the layers panel, add a hue saturation layer. Well, let's just do it. We're talking about it, okay? There we go. And then clip this layer to that layer by alter option and click between the layers till you get the little clipping icon. And then with that hue and saturation layer, go to the properties panel, click on colorize, and then pull your hue slider till you get it to a color you like. And I'm going to make mine kind of warm. So I'm just going to leave that on a yellowish look there. And that is it. So we have gotten through adding these two different streetlights to a night scene. Now, one other thing here I want to show you, well, maybe two things, but let me show you the before and the after, okay? So there's before without the streetlights and after. So it gives it a lot more realistic kind of look. And I'm going to pause for a moment and open up something else that I just want to show you related to this. So again, just as a reminder, this is the image that I started with, and let me just move it up so you can see it a little bit better. We added the street lights to it, and then you can also add spotlight effects, which I'm going to show you in the next video. So I combined the lens flares that we just did in this video with a bit of a spotlight to light up the guy that I composited into this scene. So as you can see, you can make some pretty radical changes either by working with a straight photo that you started with and just making some minor lens flare adjustments too, or you can actually go into the compositing realm and start creating whole new looks with lens flares and also with the lighting effects that I'm going to show you in the part 2 video. So again, you just sort of have to think about the logic of where the lights are coming from. If it's hitting on one side of somebody or something, it's going to be in shadow on the other side, and just be logical about how you're going to use your lights. So this is the end of the part 1 video workshop that I was going to show you. So in this first part, I talked about what lens flare is, the different types of lens flare that can be created both in camera and in Photoshop as a filter. I showed you examples of how to work with Photoshop's lens flare filter non-destructively using a couple of different methods. One was directly on the duplicate layer, one was on a filled empty layer. I also mentioned things that you can do to prepare for Adobe discontinuing its 3D features, which includes the lighting filters. So those are things that were mentioned towards the beginning of the video. In my part 2 video that is accompanying this one, I'll explain and show a demo working with Photoshop's lighting effects filter. So keep in mind that, again, you can combine these lens flares and lighting effects together like I have in this composite, so they don't have to be used discretely. You can mix and match them either in straight or composite images. So this is the end of video part 1, and look for video part 2, which will focus on the lighting effects filter. Take care.